I guess the first thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to ask people here, and you can just shout this out, obviously, just a couple of people, without thinking about it. What's the first thing you think of when you hear disability?
Wheelchairs.
Mm-hmm.
Challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Unemployment.
Stigmas.
Yes.
Old age.
Hmm. Yeah, so those are some fantastic examples, and when that first pops out in my head, that's really the first thing that I think of too, is lesser than or unable. And I think the word itself sort of brings up a lot of things, brings up images in our head, and it brings up, maybe ideas of what we thought that was before we developed LHON. And I know that was the case for me. My case of being diagnosed a little bit different. I went to a local eye doctor, and he said, "I think you have LHON, but I'm not qualified to tell you that." And he said, "So I think you should go to New York City," because I was living in Connecticut at the time. That's where I grew up. He said, "You could see a specialist down there that specializes in neuro-ophthalmology, and they will be able to confirm it. I really can't tell you for sure." I had no idea what it was. It was shocking. I didn't really believe it. And so I go down to this neuro-ophthalmologist in New York City who says to me, "Listen, don't ask about laser surgery. Don't ask about a cure. There isn't one. This is what you have. We'll do the DNA test, but in about 7 weeks it'll be confirmed. And you're just going to have to live with it. There's no cure, maybe in 20 or 30 years, but even then I don't really think so." And it was one of those moments of just feeling completely devastated, as though there was just no hope, and oh my God, I am never going to have a job. I'm going to have to drop out of college. I was a sophomore in college at the time, 20 years old. This was in April of 2003. Never going to have a love life, never going to have kids, and those were the thoughts that were rushing in my mind as this medical doctor was telling me, don't ask about anything. There's nothing we can do. And that's just the worst thing you can hear. And I think I've dedicated my career since then to realizing one thing, which is we need to be better than that as professionals when we talk to our patients. And so that's one of my biggest goals as a psychologist moving forward, is to make sure that I educate other professionals about the language that we use and the way we talk to our patients, because people can't hear that. It's almost not acceptable. It isn't acceptable. And so this is going to be a very quick and dirty, because it's going to be fast, talk about some of the research that I've done over the last couple of years. After going through college and dealing with some adversity and the adjustment process to LHON, I graduated with a degree in psychology from Western Connecticut State University. And I realized, as most bachelor's degree recipients in psychology realize, you kind of have to go further to do anything with that. And so I pursued a master's degree in counseling at Boston University and realized that I was really passionate about research and disability work and how all of this integrates together with the clinical work that I was doing, working with children and then eventually college students. And so, I decided to move on to a PhD program, and I was accepted into Seton Hall University, which I'm very grateful for my experience there, because I had a mentor who said, "You want to do research on LHON? I don't really know what that is, but go for it." And so she was very open about, letting me try this. And I'm lucky to be from a pretty diverse research lab where people were interested in what it was about and, where my research could go. So I'm going to present quickly on that, talk about 2 studies that I've done over the last 3 years on the psychological impact of LHON. And obviously, if anyone wants some of these slides afterwards, I can email them. I can email some of the results of the studies to anyone who's interested, can talk over lunch in more detail, because this might be a little bit briefer than is possible to get into all the nuts and bolts of what went on in both of these studies. So what got me interested was realizing, that it's great that so many people are here, but we are a pretty small community because genetic diseases are so rare. In this introduction slide right here, it's stating that there's about 4,000 known genetic diseases, and there's new ones discovered every year. And that's something that's pretty emotional for me in thinking about is, who's going to be here next year that might have a child or might themselves become affected within the next year that isn't right now? Or who would not have been sitting here last year that's had someone in their life affected within the last year? So there's new one discovered every year. They're developing in individuals every year. And genetic diseases are extremely rare, affecting one in thousands and millions of people worldwide. There's a description of LHON. We all know what that is, so we can skip through that. And you know, I think the biggest thing here was why I got interested in looking at the psychological impact was talking to so many people over the phone or online and realizing that this is a really tough adjustment process and that it feels like you're alone, but you're really not. We're all sort of going through that process. And let's look at some data and figure out what that's about and what's going on for people that are dealing with that. And so, you know, a lot of the language used in social science research are terms like temporarily able-bodied, right? So we're all temporarily able-bodied. At some point in our lives, we might become disabled with something, whether it's an older age or in young adulthood or as children. And with that can come something called learned helplessness, which is this idea of others trying to do everything for you because they're trying to help, but sometimes that can cause you to not believe that you can have that independence anymore. And so I really think that's important moving forward in terms of looking at LHON research, but any research, because individuals with disabilities right now make up 22% of the United States population. It is the largest minority group in the country, and it's rarely discussed as a diversity variable. And so these conversations need to happen. So the next slide is about, it's actually a poster that I did at the American Psychological Association in 2012 in Orlando, Florida. This poster won Best Student Poster Presentation. I was really proud of that because I was really excited to see that so many psychologists cared enough about this. Basically, what I looked at here in this poster board presentation was my second-year project at Seton Hall, which I decided to look at how individuals with LHON cope. And so this study had 86 people fill out an online survey, all of whom had lost their vision due to LHON. 62 that filled it out were male and 24 were female, sort of aligns with some of the averages that we talk about. This study in particular was pretty much male-dominated, and pretty much dominated in terms of individuals being white or Caucasian, which is interesting because typically with LHON it does not discriminate. So that might skew this sample a little bit. But I thought what was interesting about this was that I had individuals fill out two surveys. One was the impact of vision impairment questionnaire, and it looked at how a vision impairment impacts someone from multiple domains. The most important one for this study being the emotional impact. And then I decided to look at a protective factor that's been found throughout the literature with other disabilities to be beneficial, which is social support. So is there a correlation? Is there a nice connection there between individuals that get more social support from their family, friends, or a significant other and their ability to cope better emotionally with the diagnosis of LHON using their scores on the impact of vision impairment questionnaire? So the results, interesting enough, were sort of mixed in terms of not really finding social support to be a strong protective factor for dealing with LHON with issues like leisure or work and career decision making. But the biggest impact for this population was the emotional subscale of the impact of vision impairment questionnaire, which is sort of the one I was most hoping to find anyway. And overall scores on a multiple scale of social support and the impact of vision impairment questionnaire were aligned. And so looking at social support from family, friends, and a significant other and combining that all together found it to be that individuals with higher scores on that coped better with LHON. And you know, I think this makes sense based on everything that we've heard so far this morning from the journey of LHON, which is that having a significant other that is really there for you. I know that was really important for me. Having parents that will show up at conferences like this one and do anything they can sit there and try out that eyewear and see if it's worth buying, or getting up and speaking at this conference. I mean, that type of support goes a long way, and it's noticed, even if sometimes through frustration from the individual that's affected, it might not seem like it's getting noticed. It is. And friend group, very important, especially with LHON, where the classic case of LHON happens in young adulthood. That's when people are sort of figuring out who they are and developing a friend group, or already having a pretty strong one in place. And so it makes sense that that would be a pretty strong protective factor in how individuals cope with LHON too, because that's a strong sense of support, and one that's sort of related to their own age group, which I think is really important during this time of life. And so that was a second-year project, pretty small-scale study, but the results, I think, were pretty interesting and sort of along what was expected. The next slide is just the topic of the next study that I did, which was done over the last year, and this was sort of the big one, which is my dissertation. I found, pretty significant results with individuals who were affected by LHON, but I kind of wanted to look at those who were unaffected. So for my second-year project, I looked at the impact of genetic disease on the family members. So examining the relationship between levels of psychological well-being, using a questionnaire that looks at psychological distress, interpersonal problems, and social role dysfunction, and more protective factors and how those help. So again, I wanted to look at the protective factor of perceived social support, because that was beneficial for individuals that had lost their vision. And I sort of made the assumption and the hypothesis that it would be beneficial for mothers and siblings as well. And also looked at spirituality, because in most of the literature that's available, while there's no literature on psychological impact of LHON, sort of broaden that out to literature on disability in general and other genetic diseases. And spirituality and religion seem to be very helpful in coping with those conditions. And so I wanted to see if that would be the same case with this population. Next up, this is sort of the statement of the problem and the decision to go forward with this study, which just sort of what I talked about. Most of the literature has anything to do with LHON, but in addition, it's mostly focused on the individual that has a disability. So not much research on family members at all on any disability. There's just not much disability literature out there. And Dr. Nancy Newman down at Emory University, who's one of the top neuro-ophthalmologists and has done a lot of research over the last few decades, said that anecdotally, there's no data behind this, but said that psychological stress in a 2009 article could have an impact on individuals getting LHON. So perhaps someone that's been unaffected, psychological stress could cause them to become affected. And dealing with high levels of stress could become a protective factor in realizing, well, let's get someone to calm that anxiety down if they don't have vision loss yet, because we've seen in other diseases, especially autoimmune diseases, and I know LHON is not one of those, but that's where some of the strongest data lies, that psychological stress can trigger various diseases to become onset. And so that's something important to look at from a place of a protective factor. And again, I think this is important for this research because there is none on LHON. And so I think this is sort of groundbreaking in terms of it being the first. And I think it's long overdue. So the study that I did, the design of it was causal comparative, which means that I'm looking at, with this study, how mothers and siblings' levels of psychological well-being compared to the general overall population of people that completed the same survey, which is called the Outcome Questionnaire 45, a survey that's been tested and is reliable and valid through various tests before and different studies. And so comparing that is that part of it. The other part is correlational, which means I ran some regressions with my statistics and just looked at how social support and spirituality impacted individuals who were affected, and if that increased their levels of psychological well-being, or whether it had no impact at all. So to quickly go over some of these results. Right off the bat, just some demographic information. 117 people completed the survey. This was actually just over the last few months. Some of you sitting here might have completed the survey. Of that group, 65 were mothers and 52 were siblings. It looks sort of glaring that 100 of them would be female, but that just makes sense, right? Because most of them that completed the survey were mothers. And it's more likely that unaffected siblings would be female. So it is sort of a high number there, but I think that makes sense. 17 were male. 104 of the respondents, similarly to the second-year project I did on individuals who were affected, were white, so it was mostly a white or Caucasian sample. 10 were Latino or Hispanic, 2 identified as Asian, and 1 self-identified as Black or African American. So once again, in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, not much of that in this sample. I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. And interestingly enough, most were married between the 45 and 55-year-old age range, and most of the participants had children. So moving forward. So there were 6 hypotheses in this study. The first hypothesis, which I had talked about, which was that individuals who have a child who's been affected by LHON-related vision loss, my hypothesis was that they would have higher levels of psychological distress, social role dysfunction, and interpersonal problems than a normative sample, so the general population. This hypothesis was partially supported, and I had some interesting results with this one. So mothers of someone with LHON have higher levels of psychological distress than the overall general population. Makes sense, right? This is very hard to deal with. It's very hard to deal with when it's your own child. It could be very scary. There could be some feelings of guilt, some feelings of depression, really hard things to deal with that are not often talked about and are sometimes taboo. So it makes sense why those scores were higher. Interpersonal problems, that was not an issue. That was not statistically significant. And looking back on it now, I think that makes sense. I think most mothers are sort of in a phase of life where they're comfortable with who they are and where they stand. And so I think for that reason, that was not an issue. What was sort of an opposite than what was expected was social role was actually increasingly higher than the average population, which means that they felt more confident in their social role in the family. And I think that makes a lot of sense too, why that would be an opposite result than what I was expecting in the hypothesis, because a lot of mothers might feel like, let's kick it into gear. I am now going to take on that caretaker role more than ever. Really need to take care of my child here, whether it's coming to conferences or looking up every possible fact or information I can find about LHON or how to get my son or daughter through college or any type of assistance I can provide them. That role within the family is maybe more heightened than it was before the LHON onset. And so that makes a lot of sense too when we look at the results here. The second hypothesis, this will be pretty quick because nothing was statistically significant. In terms of spirituality, it was not correlated as a protective factor for mothers. In other words, mothers' scores and levels of psychological well-being were not improved once levels of spirituality and religion increased. So that wasn't seem to be any connection there, which is sort of interesting to me because in other research with disability there is a lot of that. So there could be a lot of reasons for that, just including the questionnaire that I used. I think that's why future studies might still want to look at this as a variable that's a protective factor. Third hypothesis for my dissertation study was that perceived levels of social support for mothers would increase their psychological well-being and ability to cope and adjust. That was partially supported. And in particular, as I had talked about with individuals who were affected, there being social support from friends, a significant other, or a family member. The area here that was statistically significant was social support from a family member really seemed to increase mothers' levels of psychological well-being. So really having that support from your family, whether it's a spouse or other children in the home or perhaps the extended family really taking on a significant role, seems like a collaboration and a connection within the family really seems to help mothers of someone affected with LHON vision loss significantly. Next is a fourth hypothesis. So we're no longer looking at mothers. Now this is siblings for the final three hypotheses. This was the most statistically significant of anything here, and I thought this was really interesting, was that siblings really seem to be struggling the most, at least according to this study. So the fourth hypothesis, similar to the first one with mothers, looked at whether or not siblings' levels of psychological well-being, which were defined by psychological distress, interpersonal problems, or social role dysfunction, would be higher than that of the general population, a normative sample. everything here was statistically significant. So it showed that siblings struggled more and had more interpersonal problems, social role dysfunction, and interpersonal problems and psychological distress levels than the normative sample. For anyone that's interested in statistics in the room, these were all significant at the 0.01 and 0.001 level, which is pretty much the most significant results can get. And I think this is really important because when we look at siblings, there's a lot of factors going on here. There's sort of that fear of, could this now happen to me? Or we now know this is in our family. This is kind of scary. And what does my role become in the family now that my brother or sister is affected? And so when we talk about psychological stress possibly being a trigger, and again, this is just anecdotal, there's no evidence behind that per se yet, I think that's important to look at, is that psychological distress levels are extremely high in siblings who are unaffected and have yet to lose their vision, and that's something that we want to monitor and be aware of. Next up is levels of spirituality in siblings. Very similar to the mothers, nothing here was statistically significant. So the hypothesis was rejected. That individuals with higher levels of spirituality would have improved levels of psychological distress, interpersonal role, and social role dysfunction. None of that ended up being statistically significant. And again, this could be due to the measure, and in future studies it would be interesting to continue to look at this variable. The final thing here is the sixth hypothesis, which looked at perceived social support. Similarly to with mothers, this too found that the family variable was the most significant. So really getting that support from your family. And I think that's really important for siblings who are unaffected, because I know in my family, when I lost my vision, there was this urgency to we don't know what this is. We need to try to fix this, or there's got to be a cure out there. And going all over the country for hospital appointments and visiting with various neuro-ophthalmologists and talking to people for endless hours on the phone, and it sort of put everyone else in the family in the background. And I think that could be tough for the siblings, and realizing that they're still part of this family system, maybe more important than they ever were in terms of providing support to their sibling and also getting support. And so the family factors seem to really increase levels of psychological well-being, more so than any other. And that was my final hypothesis. And so I just want to talk real quick about some limitations of my dissertation, which I think are really important things, which was that, from a multicultural standpoint, my sample was not very diverse. And I think it's important to, be more inclusive and try to find a more diverse sample and see what other families are going through, because there are differences in coping based on culture, socioeconomic status, different religions. This really didn't look at which religion do you identify as or how often do you go to church. And so things like that could be interesting, or how many siblings do you have, and combining that data to see how that impacted things. So really deepening the scope here, I think, would be important. As well, another limitation was that one of the options on the survey was not biracial or multiracial. That could have eliminated some very important people from the study. So I want to make sure to include all groups moving forward. Something really important was that my research study was in English. So if someone does not speak English, they didn't participate. So their data was not included here. They also had to have internet access to complete the survey. I think that is really important. We're all sitting here and we know what LHON is. We're pretty privileged. There's people in the world right now that are losing their vision in poor parts of the world that probably don't even know why. They still don't know. And so they don't know that they have LHON. They just think that this happened to them or that it's something within their family. And so they're not able to participate in studies like this because that knowledge base isn't already there like it is for those of us sitting here. And moving forward, what's the point of all this really? Why is this relevant? What does it mean? I think it means a lot. One of this talks about the core components of Division 17. That's what I'm a part of within the American Psychological Association, which is a division of counseling psychology. And one of the initiatives in psychology over the last 5 or 6 years has really been this push for an integrative care model. How, as psychologists, do we integrate with other mental health professionals, vocational rehabilitation professionals, and medical professionals? And I think this is really important. And it reminds me of that first visit when I was diagnosed and I was told there's nothing you can do and you just have to leave the office, because that's sort of how we're left sometimes. We get the diagnosis, we finally figure out what it is, and it's like, then what? And so I think if there's more collaboration between mental health providers like myself and neuro-ophthalmologists that are diagnosing individuals with LHON, proper referrals can be made, whether it's for support groups, whether it's for pointing out that this community exists and that there's conferences occurring every year, getting more people in the know, making referrals to psychologists in the area. I think this is all really important because it provides sort of this connection. I also think it's really important, whether they like it or not, to educate some people about the language that we use and using more person-centered language. I cannot tell you guys in this room how many times I've gone to a doctor's appointment or a visit and I've heard LHON in room 3. And I will sit there waiting and thinking, that's who I am, I'm LHON. And you know, as a psychologist, that's mortifying. I cannot imagine the front desk calling me and saying, your bipolar client is in the waiting room. I mean, that's just, we'd never talk like that. It's just, it's horrible to even think of something like that, and it sort of puts on this label that really makes someone feel like that's all that they are. And what we've heard all day today at this conference is that that's a part of who we are, and it's something that we're dealing with, adjusting to, and struggling with, but we're all capable of so much, and we're all doing so much more with our lives, and some incredible, inspirational stuff that I've heard today. And so to hear someone say, you're LHON in room 3, that's just not who anyone in this room is. And so when I talked earlier about us needing to do better, that's what I meant. That we need to do better as professionals, medical professionals, mental health professionals, about using language that's inclusive and recognizing that disability is important and it's a diversity variable and it is the largest minority group in the United States and it needs to get more attention than it currently does. And that LHON needs some of that too. And so while this is just a small start and some of these research studies are just the first and they need to be expanded on, obviously, to find out if this data is legitimate or whether it needs to be continued and tested more, I think that's where future research can go. But I think it's really, really essential for all of us in here and for all of our psychological well-being that we find that out and that we really advocate for ourselves. I'm an intern this year at the University of Notre Dame, and being in Indiana, there's not much public transportation. And I'll tell one quick story and then I'll be done. I called for a taxi in February. It's about 20 degrees below zero, and I'm calling for this cab at about 6 p.m., and they said it'll be about an hour. And so it's now 7:30. And the taxi has not arrived. And I said, well, it's been about another 30 minutes. I think I need to call. And so I call the cab company, and the owner says, I don't know what's going on. The guy was there, and he left. I got to call somebody else, and it'll be 15 minutes. And so now it's 8 o'clock. And I said, well, this time I'm not waiting another 30 minutes. It's already been an extra 15. And so the driver, the dispatcher says to me, I can't get any drivers to you. I don't know what to tell you. There's too many Africans and they don't know how to drive. They're too lazy. That's a conversation for another conference probably, but in terms of that comment, that shocked me, and he said, just call another cab company because none of these guys want to pick you up. So I call another cab company. It's now 8:30 p.m. when I'm trying to get out of work by 6. They pick me up. I get in the cab, and the driver says, where are you going? And I give him my address, and I said, you take credit cards, right? And he says, absolutely not. If I knew that, I never would have picked you up. And I said, well, we can stop at an ATM, and I'll just take the money out. And he says, that's fine. All of a sudden, we're pulling up to my apartment complex, and I said, don't we have to go to the gas station to go to the ATM? And he says, just get out. He says, just get out, and he says, never play me again. And I said, I'm not playing you. I absolutely would have paid you, and we can go right now. And he said, just get out. And so he doesn't even drop me off in front of my apartment. He drops me off on this road, a main road. Knew about my vision and just didn't seem to care. And so this was a situation where it was time to call the next day and tell the cab company what happened. Because it's freezing, there's ice all over the ground, and that's a long walk when you're supposed to get dropped off right in front of your building. And so this is one small example of things that happen every day and all the time. And I'm sure many of you have stories like this one. maybe more than I do. And so I think this speaks again to that need to say, you know, people are very helpful, and it's fantastic that people are helpful. And we've seen through some of the results of the studies that people that are helpful really help us in terms of the way that we cope with things. But it's okay to advocate for yourself and say that people also need to do better. And I'll say, like, within my field, people need to do better. And so by having that advocacy and, like, that need to have social justice be a part of who we are, I think that really pulls for things to keep improving. And that excites me.